Hello everyone, and I'm Barbara Jo, and I have the pleasure today of introducing Rob from Ahead Simulations. Me and Rob met a few times over the last couple of years, mostly in relation to his company producing Carl. Teaching at the college, Carl has been a fantastic tool. There's nothing like being able to program Carl for a hearing loss that they normally wouldn't get to see in a training setting, to have them practice their masking and to have them, on the lookout for unilateral loss or something like that. You know what it's like in the program. Usually you're testing, your classmates or your partner, and they have the normal hearing or the same hearing loss. But to be able to have that variability in the classroom gives them immense confidence. And also, as a teacher, it's a great way of just testing to make sure that they are prepared for whatever the clinic throws at them down the road. So that is why I have got to know Rob, but I'm going to let him talk to you a little bit about himself and about his projects. Rob is an engineer by trade, and I must say that I think that our industry is a better place having him in it. So welcome.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm very happy to be giving this talk on behalf of the AHIP convention. I think suffice to say things got a little crazy and busy there, to say the least, so I'm happy to still be giving this talk in some sort of way. Hopefully it'll be just as informative on this webinar as it would have been in person. I'll also note as well, since there won't be any questions or anything like a live lecture at the end of it, there will be an email address included at the end, so that if you have any questions to ask or you want to inquire about anything, please shoot me an email afterwards. Without any further ado, I'm going to be walking you through how you can differentiate your practice through the concept and idea of continuous learning. So I'll first start with an aspirational quote from Jack Welch. He was previous CEO of GE, and he was a big voice on management and company performance a handful of years. And that quote is, "An organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage." I think something I want to point out here is learning and education. It's not always the sexy buzzword that gets people interested. Even the title of my talk, it may not be as, exciting as some new piece of technology that's just starting to come out. But today I really want to try to turn the tides on that and show really how a culture of learning and emphasizing learning can make all the difference inside of your practice. So what we'll cover today is, number one, what is the most effective way to learn? So let's take a step back and look at the best practices for throughout our lives. How do we most efficiently learn and implement that learning? Two, how does this specifically apply to our practice, our clinical practice? And third, which is probably one of the most important ones, is really how do we justify investing in this? Everyone runs a business here, and we need to make sure that when we're trying to differentiate through continuous learning, when we're trying to emphasize education, that there is a really solid business case so that we can continue to invest in it and really prove that investing in it does pay off. So before I get into all of that, I'll provide a little bit more background on myself. I'm Rob. I'm the president and founder at Ahead Simulations. As you can probably tell from my photo here, this image was taken a whole pandemic ago when I still had hair and didn't exactly cut my hair on my own. At that time in that picture, I was doing my master's of biomedical engineering at Western University in London, Canada. I was, an engineering student, and I was trying to see and trying to find a really cool project that I could spend a couple of years on, and that's when I was introduced to the audiology faculty there. And they had really identified that, okay, there's other medical disciplines like nursing and med schools. They have all these fancy simulators which they can use to train and teach their students in a most effective and safe way. And audiology at the time were still poking and prodding their own ear. This would have been 2015. And so Carl, which was my project, this is what resulted from this need. And I continued to develop Carl through my education, ultimately founded Ahead Simulations in 2018, and found that there really was a broader need for utilizing something like Carl inside of hearing healthcare. And I think what's been really interesting since introducing Carl in 2018 is just the far-reaching impacts of continuous learning and how spending time on these sorts of topics can really impact the business as a whole. And that's really where a lot of my talk is coming from today, routed in what we've seen in the last handful of years, really trying to empower education within this industry. So this is usually how I like to start this part of the talk here, which is what topic is top of mind for everyone. If this talk was still happening during the convention, I'm sure there'd be lots of different talks, lots of different ideas that are floating around in your head. After a couple of busy conference days, you're usually overloaded with ideas and things to do. But that might be OTC, DTC, that might be ADP or billing requirements, that might be AI and machine learning. How is all that gonna impact us? Should I start implementing this into my practice? There's probably a lot of things that you can look at to really emphasize, and differentiate your clinic. But what I'm going to step into today is that things always change. There is always new things. There is always new technology. There is always new, macro environment trends in which we should be aware of. And really, the way to stay on top of all that is learning and education. And really being able to understand those new topics, again, thinking of the quote from Jack Welch, is that utilizing education, being able to implement it quickly, can really differentiate and help you win and beat your competitors. Learning education is absolutely crucial to your clinic success. Two different sides of that I'm going to touch on throughout this talk, one of which is the education of team members. So you want to standardize a high standard of care and do a killer job guiding your consumers, guiding your patients. And then the other side is when your team members are operating at the top of their practice, when they know everything that they need to in order to guide patients, that's when let's implement some of our best practice learning and education into helping them. And really, with all these topics that are up in the air, a clinic who can do both of these extremely well will weather whatever changes come to the industry and ultimately reap the rewards. If you even look back at something like COVID, that was a massive change inside of this industry as well as the entire world. And really, the people who were able to stay on top of that was, okay, taking in a bunch of this new information, being able to see where we are and make a decision based on the new information that's there. And really, that's down to learning and education. So before I dive into the details about how this actually applies to your practice, we're going to spend part one talking about what is the most effective way to learn. And the way that I like to do this is trying to compare a lot of the, clinical learnings, a lot of the stuff that may be happening in your clinic, compare it to in the past when you have learned other skills or other topics from the ground up. So whether it's learning algebra when you're in school or your kids are in school, whether it's learning to swim, whether it's learning to take impressions, believe it or not, there's a common framework which can allow us to be as successful and as efficient as possible in learning this new task. So stepping this down a little bit more, learning to swim, let's focus on that one first. How did you originally, or how did your kids learn how to swim? Did you plop them in the deep end and say they'll figure it out? Or did you start outside of the pool and you talked about the fundamentals of swimming? Then you practiced arm and leg movements out of the water. Then you went in the water to get comfortable to that new environment. Then with a life jacket on, you started to do your strokes. And then you'd use a noodle or a flutter board, and then eventually you would be okay swimming on your own inside of the deep end, and then you could add strokes. So as you can see, it's a very progressive way of doing things, and we can take that same framework and apply it to a whole bunch of other areas in which we need to learn something new as efficiently and especially for you as cost efficiently as possible. So the first model that I'm going to break through here is the knows how, and shows how model. This is primarily called Miller's Pyramid, and it describes how clinical skills must be learned from the ground up. This really became popular in the 90s when medical simulation and medical education was uh, really changing and implementing new technology and new techniques. And this described how can we learn skills as efficiently as possible and as safe as possible, going from knows to knows how to shows how to does, and ultimately performing the skill over and over reliably. So breaking this down a little bit more, at the bottom of the pyramid, this is the foundation. You start at the bottom. First, you know how, or first you know. So you know the basic steps, you know the basic facts, and then you know how. So for example, the swimming example, first you know what is swimming, why do I have to swim? Then you say, okay, knows how. Do you know how you should be moving your arms? Do you know how you should be moving your legs? Do you know how you should be treading water? It's an initial understanding to first know what you're going to do and understand how to do it. As you can imagine, stopping at knowing how to swim is not exactly the same as being able to be plopped in the deep end and be able to, tread water and swim completely fine for, 15, 20 minutes. Once you have this initial understanding, once you have this base of the pyramid, then you move on to the top part of the pyramid, which is actually trying it for yourself. So this is where you get your hands dirty. This is where that you show that you know how to do it. And ultimately, this is where you really start performing. For practicing swimming, shows how. That's where you actually get in the pool. That's where you start making mistakes. That's where you actually fail. It doesn't mean that moving up this pyramid, and it doesn't mean that learning a new skill is going to be immediate. It doesn't mean that you're going to be, a natural and be able to do it right away. The underpinning framework is that you need to experiment and you need to get your hands dirty and really apply these learning. So then you can get to the very top of the pyramid, which is where you perform. When you perform, that is referred to as sort of the muscle memory part, where you don't need to think about it anymore. You can just do, you can perform. Another model that I'm going to talk about that corresponds with the previous one, so that was the Miller's Pyramid idea. The second one is the educational scaffolding model. And this basically hones in on three specific aspects that are incredibly important for learning something new. First is collaborative learning and exploration of a skill. So this means, collaborating with the instructor and exploring and understanding how you can do this, and, making mistakes and being able to explore your own preference of doing something and so on. So it doesn't mean that, you're just sitting in a lecture and you're taking in all this information. It does need to be collaborative. It does need to be explorative. And if you think about the way that a lot of lectures or educational institutions in universities are working now, they're starting to move more and more away from just the straight lecture format and test format. More and more, there's opportunities where you're together with a teammate or two, where you're working on labs, where you're working on activities. Being able to talk to someone and explain your thinking through it and actually apply it is incredibly valuable. Number two is teaching only within the learner's comfort level. So in the swimming example, of course, you couldn't just plop them on the deep end if they're not ready for that. I also use the learning algebra. You can't start giving them differential equations if they're not ready for that. Even something like teaching impressions in your clinical practice or in the initial school. If they don't even, if they've never used an otoscope, if they've never used any clinical tool, you can't expect them to just immediately understand and apply, a gold standard ear mold impression. You really need to hone in on where that learner's comfort level is. Finally, the use and removal of learning scaffolds. And the best way to describe this is in my swimming example. When you're comfortable and you're about to go inside of the deep end or the pool for the first time, you will likely use a life jacket or you might use a flutterboard. That flutterboard is a scaffold. It's something that makes going from one step of the skill to the new skill easier and easier. And it's basically guardrails to make sure that your exploration of the level of the skill is safe and effective and efficient. So looking at those two models together, we're going to try to combine them together here to really start to inform, when we start to have educational initiatives or training initiatives, how we can implement this inside of our practice. So for one of the last times, I'm going to be walking through the example of learning to swim again. So first at the bottom of the pool, or at the bottom of the pyramid, you're first outside of the pool, you're understanding how to swim and the steps it'll take. Then when you're in the shallow end, you're getting used to the water, you try to float, practice strokes. This is where you might have a lot of collaborative learning and exploration. This is also really, really key to remain inside the learner's comfort level. And then you step up the pyramid to ultimately showing that you know how to swim. And that would mean anything from treading water to using the flutterboard as a scaffold, all the way up to the top of the pyramid where you don't have to think about how to swim anymore. You can start implement different kinds of strokes. You can swim for longer periods and so on. So as you can imagine, this is a framework that we can implement into a variety of other purposes inside of our lives. And the few key insights that I really want to hone in on, and that will be relevant for the rest of this talk as well, is number one, throwing new learners into the deep end and seeing if they float is dangerous, inefficient, and wasteful. Not every scenario in which we learn something new is as high risk as swimming or as high risk as, something like ear mold impressions. But what's really important to mention here is that it's inefficient when you throw new learners into the deep end and see if they can swim. We have talked to all kinds of different clinicians over the years that, they had pretty scarring experience about how to do an impression for the first time, or when they were thrown in with patients and just started working on them right away when they really didn't know what they were doing or they weren't comfortable to. This has all kinds of negative downstream effects. And really, I just want you to remember that even though it may seem easy to throw them in the deep end, even though you may think that this is a rite of passage for new learners to be able to survive this and really be a better clinician overall, the fact of the matter is that's not true. And if we can implement best practice education, it's not only safer, it not only builds confidence, but they can get up to speed quicker and more cost effectively. The second part of this here is you cannot jump from nose, the bottom of the pyramid, to does at the top of the pyramid. There is always a period of experimenting and getting comfortable. And if it doesn't seem like there's any experimentation or there's any doing things wrong or if there's any failing, it probably means that they're not ready to perform. It always involves failing a few times, making mistakes. It's part of the process. And when you learn something new, you really do need to apply it until it actually becomes muscle memory. Finally, number three, having a collaborative environment while remaining in the learner's comfort level will expedite their learning. Again, is it easy to, give them a bunch of exercises to do? Is it easy to get them to watch webinars like this and, check off their CEU credit and be done with it? Of course it is. But really being able to then apply that inside of a collaborative environment and for the learner to then understand where they are, and even the educator to understand where the learner is, that will help the whole process immensely. So I really want you to try to hook on to these three things as we move throughout the presentation. So are there tools that are built to better facilitate this learning? That was all concepts about best practices and how we can look to improve the way that we educate and learn. Are there tools that can help us do this? Of course there are, and it's called simulation. Simulation recreates a real-world process or scenario so you can be as prepared as possible to encounter that situation in the real world. If you think back to the 3 points that I just mentioned on the previous slide, this allows you to remain in the learner's comfort level. It allows you to fail lots. It allows you to practice, practice, practice. It allows you to experiment. And after you get through that, then you can start performing. And something that we see quite a bit is simulation is a bit of a scary big word. It may seem and sound very expensive or time consuming or whatever that may be. And really, simulation is not a piece of technology. Simulation is a technique. And recreating real world scenarios, which is exactly what simulation is, happens way more than we realize in our day to day, especially inside of our industry. A hearing test is a simulation, believe it or not. You're trying to simulate a bunch of different sounds, a bunch of different environments to uncover how this person, how this patient is hearing in the real world. You're trying to simulate that all within your hearing assessment toolbox. And it's effective. And that's why we continue to add, new and better ways to perform hearing assessments, because there's new and better ways to simulate real world environments. A hearing aid demo is a simulation. You're trying to demonstrate to them how this hearing aid will help them or how it will work in a real world scenario. You're trying to simulate that for them. Finally, a test box and coupler measurements for real ear. When you first do that coupler measurements, you're fitting within the coupler. The coupler is made to simulate an ear canal. So I don't need to beat this horse to death anymore, but really just seeing simulation as how do we recreate this process in a safe and time-efficient manner is really going to be an underpinning of making the most of the model that we just learned about and also being able to implement it inside of our practice. Based on this, I'm sure you have 10, 20, 30 other ways in which you use simulation throughout your day-to-day. And I would just encourage you to reflect on that and to think about that and how it helps you within your practice. So finally, just another recap slide. So simulation is how you make your way up the pyramid in a safe, consistent, and efficient manner. You're trying to recreate this real-world process so that you can get hands-on and you can drive up the pyramid as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So how does this apply to our clinical practice? I'm going to try to break down 3 applications, mainly focused around the topic of the lecture, which is continuous learning. So first of all, procedures. I consider this as clinical know-how of your clinical staff or possibly even of yourself. Process, which is then following the insert clinic name standard of care. Everyone does things a little bit differently, even if they have the core clinical underpinnings to be quite similar, and being able to standardize that and ultimately, learn around and continuously improve that process. Finally, number 3, educating your patients about their hearing aids. So these are 3 spots in which really we can implement best practice education. And when we do so, we will have an enormous impact on our clinical organization, which I will also get to at the end here. So first of all, procedures. Do all clinical staff at your clinic, do they all perform their procedures according to best practices? Which is part 1. Part 2, is this also according to your minimum standard of competency? Every clinic, whether they know it or not, they have some kind of internal standard for what they consider to be good service and best practice. This may differ a little bit from what best practices is, and as you can imagine, as the clinical organizations get larger and larger, there's likely more of a variance on what that standard of competency is. And that's also probably what a lot of your smaller practices and your smaller clinics, that's probably what you're trying to differentiate on. We're a small family-owned business that we put our heart and soul into it. We do the best job possible. We're not like any of those big chains. But again, taking a step back, do we know everyone is doing these correctly? Even if they, performed onboarding, even if they have their degree, do we know for sure how they are performing these when they're with patients? Because that's ultimately what matters. That's what drives the referrals and the satisfaction and all the other outcomes that we look like. What is actually happening in each of those appointments? Whether it's initial otoscopy, whether it's wax removal, whether it's a hearing test or impressions or hearing aid fitting, all of those little pieces, not only can they do it, are they doing it to the bar that we're expecting? And really, as you could probably tell, this is where we're going to talk about simulation a little bit and say, okay, well, let's try to recreate this real world process and see exactly how they're using the clinical equipment and how they would walk through this step of the appointment. So we did a little case study with Carl here. Carl is just our simulated patient of the day. And we wanted to do just that. We wanted to see what are each of their clinicians, how are they performing inside of an actual appointment. We partnered with a clinic chain with over 20 locations, and there was 22 clinicians within the organization that participated in this case study, and they were all taught and expected to be delivering a certain standard of care within their clinic. They had a minimum standard of competency dictated within their clinic, and it was expected, and it was also assumed that all these clinicians were following that. So what we did here is the trainer in this scenario, or the owner or the director of audiology, whoever it would have been, in this case it was the director of audiology, he looked inside of the clinician's appointment, he booked a time inside of their calendar, and then instead of the clinician working with the patient, the clinician worked with Carl. So we tried to complete a mock patient fitting appointment on Carl with the supervisor present to not only assess how they're doing their clinical practice. We don't want this to seem like a high pressure, if you don't do things properly, you're failed. This is meant to be collaborative learning. This is meant to be, we're going to walk through our entire clinical process, and we're going to see if there's any gaps. And if there is, that's completely okay. No one is perfect. We're going to try to identify how we can make you become a better clinic, how we can make you become a better clinician, and really help you do a better job and help you, excel helping your patients. And so this was performed throughout, a few months, and all clinicians at this clinic, they had an advanced degree, so they either had, college diploma, master's degree, AUD degree from the US in some cases. So we sort of thought and we assumed that they would already performing at a certain level based on that, as well as the onboarding that happened at the organization. And what we actually saw when we recreated that real world scenario was a little bit different. So there was 68% of clinicians that met the minimum standard of competency per clinic operating standards. That's not what you expect. I would also note that this clinic that we worked with, they are known to, again, differentiate themselves based on a high standard of care. Inside of their values, they make it absolutely clear that, striving for the best care is what they care about, and still, whether it was just not implementing it inside of their day-to-day or whether they misunderstood something, only 68% met that minimum standard. 43% had clear gaps of training requiring remedial training, so whether that was wax removal, whether that was pediatrics, there was a few parts that were identified in some of these clinicians' toolbox which could use some improvement. Again, not the end of the world, but we'd rather know where our gaps are in being able to help them and improve them. 57% did not have effective sermon management experience or comfort. When we get to the business impacts down the line later on inside of the presentation, you'll see that's a really scary number. If there's people who are certified in sermon management, they are able to, according to their certification they received, they're able to do wax removal. What happens in the real world when a patient comes in and they have an occluded eardrum, they have a lot of wax? Even though they're certified, is this clinician going to dive in there and try to remove all the wax? Or is this clinician going to say, oh, I'm not too comfortable with this. I'm going to refer them out and get that cleaned up before I see them. You know, we saw that a lot of the times, even though a lot of the staff were certified, um, they weren't comfortable with it still. They didn't move their way up through the pyramid effectively. They didn't get to performing at that level. They didn't have enough experience to practice, to fail, to make mistakes, and to really hone in their ability. And if you look at the cost of referring someone out where you may never see this patient again because they don't come back, that's an absolutely huge number that we'll talk about. 14% were low performers and all left the organization within a year for a poor culture fit. So this was pretty telling. Again, a part of their values at the clinic was to ensure that they always have a high standard of care and that they're doing the best for their patients. It was found from this exercise that the people who really didn't excel at it and weren't happy with it, it simply wasn't a fit. And again, it's not the end of the world, but when you look at having people on your team who are aligned and really believe in what you believe, that's incredibly important. And finally, the last point, which is probably my favorite, is two clinicians with identical matching experience. They both had an AUD degree, so in the States, a doctorate degree with 8 years of clinical experience. They were complete opposites. One was a high performer, one was a low performer. And this really challenges the assumption of, looking at someone's resume, are they the right clinician to have on our team? Them having, a decent educational background and clinical experience, it doesn't matter as much as what they're actually doing in their day to day, what their experience has been. If it's 8 years of clinical experience doing the wrong thing over and over and over again, that's completely different than 8 years of clinical experience where they're always on top of things and they're learning new things and implementing new things. So a really important thing to remember as you go back to your day to day. Again, my key takeaways from our case study here: clinical experience and education is not an indicator of high quality best practices. The clinical organization needs to be aware of gaps and ensure clinicians are meeting clinical standards. I'm kind of talking about this from the clinical organization perspective, but I think it's also really important. You as an individual clinician, do you have any gaps? Are you aware of anything that you're not quite confident in? Is there anything that you're missing? That isn't a bad thing. We all have gaps. And really the best thing that you can do as a team member and as a clinician is to be aware of them and work on them. Find new ways in which you can learn and find new ways that you can, again, move up the pyramid in some of these skills, because it will really help you be a better clinician. It'll help your career, and it'll also of course help your clinic. Something else that is sort of a bit of an interesting point, considering I'm giving this talk online, is online learning that was performed prior to sessions didn't automatically transfer to hands-on skills. Again, if we think about the pyramid, you can't just do an online learning and then go back to your day-to-day and assume that that online learning is implemented immediately. There's always in the middle that part of experimentation and exploration, ideally in a collaborative environment. And really being able to take things that you learn and apply them is so incredibly important. So that was all. The clinical procedures part of it. Now, let's say that we're really fantastic at all our clinical procedures. We know how to do that according to our minimum standard of competency. What's the next step? The next step is your clinic's standard of care, your unique process, the way that you give your patients an outstanding patient experience that no one else can do the same of. We've heard a lot. We have the best standard of practice around. We're part of the community. We care about our clients. We go the extra mile. And again, a lot of this, while on the brand side, this is great. This really is you trying to differentiate your brand. What's actually happening in the day-to-day? If you have 2 clinicians, if you have 10 clinicians, do you know that each of those clinicians are actually following this process? I I don't know if this is a show or not anymore, but Undercover Boss, this was the one where someone in the C-suite would go inside of one of the lower level jobs and disguise themselves as a worker at the company to really understand what's happening in the day to day. And I thought this was really, really applicable to what we're talking about because let's say that you had a family member that went into one of your clinics and they walked through the entire patient experience from your customers, from your patient's perspective. What would they see? What would they experience? If you have three different locations and you were able to do this three times, would it all be the same? And really, there's no way to know unless you do go into depth and you pull an undercover boss and really try to simulate this environment or to look in on it for what's actually happening. And I think something that we hear as well is that there might be sessions in which there's a supervisor or an instructor present during an appointment, or even in some cases where there's a supervisor or instructor present just online and they're watching over video or they're listening in. Doing that right away, that does bias it. And while you get some really, really great information about what's going on, again, when you're, all nervous and concerned that someone is watching you, you're going to be behaving a little bit differently. So not that that is a, immediately fixable problem, but again, it's just something to note as we try to make sure that this patient experience is absolutely superb and that it's happening over and over again with all of your patients. So again, remember the pyramid here. We can't just give staff or a team member a manual of what our experience looks like and be done with it. We can't tell staff during onboarding and expect them to remember and be done with it. We can't give them 30 minutes to do an online webinar like this and be done with it. They must apply it. They must move up the pyramid. And as you can imagine, moving up this pyramid, it continues to go. There's always something new to learn, and just trying to remember these core concepts can be absolutely crucial. The third part here, patience. So again, we knocked our clinical procedures out of the park. We're then very confident that we're all following our process. Now that we're really good at this, we should be able to do a kick-ass job educating our patients. And I just pulled up this slide again, which is the example of swimming, in which you start out of the pool and then you move your way into the deep end. For patients, let's remember that it's really important to remain in the learner's comfort level. It's really important for a collaborative learning environment and exploration of a new skill. It's also really important to evolve this learning from not only cognitive and understanding it, but to behavioral and showing how and getting your hands dirty. So how do you educate your patients today? Just doing a little bit of introspection. Do you do most of the talking? Do you leave time for the patient to experiment or try the technology? Does the patient actually get hands-on and experiment for themselves? Questions like this can really open things up quite a bit. And if you look at a clinic that is trying to do the absolute best, because not only is this stuff going to help your patients better understand the technology, it's most likely also to convert to a sale more. The conversion rate is likely to be more if you're remaining inside of their comfort level, if you're speaking their language, if you're doing everything that you can to make sure that they're fundamentally understanding and they're succeeding with the technology that you're recommending. This can have some broad implications. For something like teaching them about their hearing aid, can the front of house staff help you with this? Do you dedicate a certain amount of time in the appointment to this? Can you get the patient learning and applying before they leave for the appointment? And I know a lot of people out there do things like this, but just being able to take a step back and think about it from this perspective can be incredibly valuable. So a couple examples. How do you teach clients about their hearing aids and proper insertion right now? We've heard quite a few examples in which, people, they might leave with their hearing aid and then they come back shortly after and complaining about some kind of issue when the hearing aid isn't actually placed in their ear properly. They didn't understand how it fits on their ear. When we talk about moving up the pyramid, and what's one of the most fundamental skills that they need to understand so that they can move into the deep end and explore a bunch of the other technology, one of them is absolutely, how does this fit on my ear? How do I replace the battery or charge it? All of that fundamental stuff that might be kind of boring for the clinician that wants to dive into all this cool technology, really understanding where their comfort level is. And of course, not only letting them figure it out, but showing them on their own ear and doing it inside of the appointment and making sure that they have shown you how they know how to do this. Again, using simulation, a lot of people, they might do this on their own ear. They might have a little demonstration ear, or we have a couple sites that are actually using Carl, our simulated patient, as well. So clinician, patient, and family member gets hands-on with the different styles of hearing aids and what the different hearing aids look like. The clinician can demonstrate how to do it. Then the patient and family member can try how to do it on a simulated model, and then they can do it on themselves. And this might sound like some additional time added to your appointment, but really being able to, again, do this as effectively and as efficiently, making sure that you spend time on something that they're nervous about is absolutely worth it. And it really should reduce the amount of time down the line that you need to spend re-educating on some stuff that you thought they might have understood. Another one is, do you demo the hearing aid and its features to the patient and their family? I've heard some spots where they just tell them how it works and hand it over and, hope for the best and hope that all that sunk in. Some places use hearing aid demonstration tools. Again, I have Carl there, and there's been some sites that have used that to try to teach and educate what the different hearing aid and features are. One of my favorite examples is a clinician that we've worked with. He does not want to try to explain to patients what Bluetooth is and why they need it. All he does is he puts the hearing aid on the patient's ear. He makes sure that the hearing aid is connected to the patient's phone, and then the front of house staff calls the patient phone, and it's like magic when the phone rings through the hearing aid. All of a sudden, they understand it. They understand the value of Bluetooth and why they need it, and they didn't need to know anything about how the technology works. This is demonstrating it and really understanding at their comfort level and their understanding. Why is this important to them? How is this going to affect them? And then, of course, there's other examples where, you might put the hearing aid on the ear, you might step out of the store, you might have some simulated environments. Again, whatever you can do to really stay within their learning comfort level, collaborate with them, explore the uses that are most important to them. And I know this sounds like a lot because you have a really condensed appointment time. But again, a lot of time on this can not only lead to a higher conversion rate, but lead to a higher success rate. So really, when you look at all these steps that I've gone through, the procedures, clinical know-how, the process, following your standard of care, and then patients, educating your patients, if you can knock all of these out of the park, holy cow, you're going to excel. You're going to do absolutely fantastic. And when a new equipment comes in, when a new procedure comes in, that's easy. You just implement it in the same way, and you can stay on top of these trends and continue to differentiate. So how do we justify investing in this, and what is the business case? I kind of see this as a 1, 2, 3, and you move down the stack. So you can't really educate your patients extremely well about hearing aids unless you have the clinical know-how and you're following your standard of care. So really, it's important to make sure that the procedures part of it is absolutely solid before you move your way down, and trying to tie some metrics that matter here. Procedures, clinical know-how. So this can affect remake rate. We have one specific site, which is a large clinical chain. They saw their remake rate decrease by 75% after implementing simulation through mannequins to train and certify their staff members how to do impressions. That is huge. That is massive. Return rate. are they fitting the hearing aid effectively? Are the patients set up to succeed as much as possible through the clinician's procedures? Efficiency of appointment time. If you're really good and you're performing at the top of that pyramid with all of your clinical process, you're flying. You can go through all of the procedures like the back of your hand compared to if you're trying to remember how to do this and how to do this. Process, that's really where the conversion rate and return rate comes into a play. So being able to follow that effectively and all of your locations doing the same thing, that will optimize those. And then of course, patients, educating your patients about their hearing aids. Average sale price, being able to educate them about why this better technology levels are better for them. All of this will ultimately trickle down into your patient satisfaction, into your referrals, success with hearing aids, Google reviews, and ultimately that big holy grail, which is differentiation. What is it not focus? What is it costing you to not focus on learning in this way? Wasted appointment time, inconsistent patient experiences, patients struggling with hearing aid or not using it, reduced margins, reduced conversions, inconsistent metric tracking. You can't really believe what you're seeing. All of this stuff can be a result of your education and your procedures, process, and patients not being consistent and being a little bit all over the place. And I think something that's really important as I wrap up here is what we're talking about when we talk about continuous learning and training and education is really an emphasis on your team. You're investing in your team, you're investing in your people, in their professional growth. Spending time on your team, growing your team, improving all of your teammates so that they'll be better for the rest of their career, that has enormous downstream advantages to not only you, but all of your team members through enhanced skill, improved performance, increased employee satisfaction, adaptability to change, employee retention in an industry where turnover is quite large, being able to retain your employees because you genuinely care about them and you want them to do a better job. Innovation, safety and risk mitigation, your company culture, all of this stuff is really a result of implementing that educational value and making sure that everyone is doing the best job that they can. In really summarizing this at the end here, differentiating through continuous learning is really that combination of clinician education and patient education that will ultimately drive a lot of your KPIs for your clinic and make not only the clinician, but also the clinic extremely successful. And since I started with a quote, I'll also end with a quote. Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And if this isn't an absolutely fantastic summary for what we talked about throughout this presentation and a great description of really what the Miller's Pyramid is all about, then I don't know what else is. We've been doing this a lot, and this is what we encourage with our product Carl over and over again. Don't be afraid to try to experiment. Don't be afraid to learn something new. Don't be afraid to fail, but let's do that in an efficient manner, in a safe manner, so that when you're with your patients, you are knocking it out of the park every single time. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. You can see I have my email address there. It is also misspelt. It should be at Ahead Simulations, just like the company name. You can also see our website at aheadsimulations.com. It's been really amazing the last handful of years seeing how important and how crucial it can be and how big of a difference it can really be when you emphasize these education and learning concepts. And I'd be absolutely thrilled to talk with anyone after. Again, feel free to shoot us an email. We're always happy to chat, and I really hope that people were able to get something valuable out of this. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Hope to talk soon.